The Viking invasions, an era of danger, destruction, and courage in the history of England. We can't consider this period of time without speaking the name Alfred the Great. Alfred, King of the West Saxons, has long been celebrated as a key hero in English history. In an age when all seemed lost, this man stood against the odds in defiance of oblivion. For this, his name is immortal. In Alfred's day, the idea of a united English kingdom was barely even a dream. England was composed of many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, all of them woefully unprepared for the sudden arrival of the Vikings. In 839, Ecgbert, King of Wessex, the domain of the West Saxons, was a tired and ailing old man after having ruled 37 years. He sent a letter to one of his old allies, Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne and Emperor of the Franks. In this letter, Ecgbert described the recent vision of a priest. The priest had seen the grieving souls of saints in a church, writing in blood all the sins of the English. This, Ecgbert explained, was a warning. Unless sinners repented, England would experience catastrophe. For 3 days and nights, a very dense fog will spread over their land, and then, all of a sudden, pagan men will lay waste with fire and sword most of the people and land of the Christians, along with all they possess. Such was the mood of the era, when Viking raids seemed constant. For many, the end of the world was at hand. The Vikings hailed from the remote lands of Scandinavia, a world very much unlike Anglo-Saxon England. For some 200 years, kings had gifted royal estates to the church across Britain and Ireland, fostering productive, wealthy economies. Nothing of the sort existed in Scandinavia. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, fertile land was limited to the narrow coastal plains, and warrior clans, well armed and steeped in ancient traditions of feuding, were almost impossible for the chieftains to control. Once the Anglo-Saxons themselves had maintained such a fierce warrior spirit, but much of that had been lost as they'd grown prosperous. We can barely overstate the unpreparedness of these insular, settled English kingdoms for the arrival of these invaders from Scandinavia. The Vikings were fast-moving, water-based, and playing by a totally new set of rules. They had little to lose and much to gain. Their women and children waited safely at home for their return, from lucrative plundering expeditions to supplement their scant living from fishing and farming. By the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings had basically achieved naval supremacy. Generations of perfecting this craft had made them experts in the construction of swift vessels, capable of deep-sea sailing, raiding, and river navigation. Ships carried a symbolic importance comparable to the horse for later medieval knights. Vikings celebrated their vessels in song as sea steeds cruising the roads of Wales. Alfred the Great is today widely regarded as a founding figure in English history, but during his own time he may have seemed like the final defender of an ill-fated kingdom, making its last stand. By the early 9th century, Viking raids into England were common. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes frequent, brutal attacks by the heathen Danes and Norsemen. Chilling accounts tell of West Saxon nobles making desperate stands against ruthless warriors from the north. It was during this period that King Ethelred died, and his brother, Alfred, became king of the West Saxons in 871. Although Alfred is remembered as a great English king, he did not rule a united England. His territory, Wessex, the realm of the West Saxons, stood in defiance of Viking invaders. But it was during Alfred's reign that the foundations were laid for united England. So who were these Vikings that created such desperate trials for Alfred and his people? Emerging from the Scandinavian north, their skill as navigators took them across Russia, northern France, the British Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and possibly even North America. They hungered for exploration and adventure, and piracy was their way of life. They traveled in war bands, with the ship's company acting as the core combat unit. By adorning their halls with captured wealth, and their wives and daughters with lavish jewelry and ornaments, Viking nobles expressed their greatness. Today, when archaeologists excavate Viking sites, They find artifacts from the far-flung corners of the 9th century world, coins of Byzantium and Arab lands, plunder from European churches and monasteries. Initially, Vikings came as raiders, but at some point they got the idea of remaining as conquerors. In 865, a large coalition of mainly Danish Vikings, described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. They crossed into Northumbria and captured York. Many of the English kingdoms were powerless to resist, but Alfred the Great and his West Saxons would make a stand. By 878, the Danes held the east and northeast of England. That March, Alfred and his warriors made a secret base at the marshes of Somerset, where they planned resistance against the Danish king Guthrum, leader of the Great Heathen Army. Alfred assembled his troops in May for a surprise attack. They fell upon the Danes at Edington. There, a fierce battle took place that would be recorded in the medieval life of Alfred. Fighting ferociously, forming a dense shield wall against the whole army of the pagans, and striving long and bravely, at last Alfred gained the victory. He overthrew the pagans with great slaughter, and smiting the fugitives, he pursued them as far as the fortress. Alfred's army besieged the Danes at Edington for a fortnight. At last, the starving Danes asked Alfred for a peace, offering him hostages and promising to depart the kingdom. They also agreed that Guthrum and his leading men would be baptized. Alfred's great victory at Edington was not the end of his trouble with the Danes. However, in the future, Alfred would take the offensive. In 886, he captured London. From 892 to 896, a new Danish army stalked about England. Up to the last decade of his reign, Alfred had to be constantly vigilant in defending his kingdom. A great deal of Alfred's success can be attributed to his organizational abilities. The Danes had the advantage of mobility, able to move quickly by ship and attack unexpectedly. Alfred took steps to counter this. He built his own ships and took an interest in their design so that they might be most effective against his Viking foes. Alfred's inquiring mind always sought to overcome a problem. Alfred also streamlined his military organization so that troops could be assembled more quickly and kept in the field for longer. He divided the militia in such a way that manpower was available to staff the army, hold fortresses, and till the fields all at once. He also established for landowners the obligation of building and maintaining fortresses. Alfred began constructing a network of fortresses that would crisscross his kingdom, providing protection for people and livestock in times of invasion. Alfred also showed himself genuinely concerned for the general welfare of his subjects. He strove for integrity in the law and issued a legal code, known today as the Code of Alfred, which compiled Anglo-Saxon legal ideas and divine law as expressed in the Christian Bible. The era of Viking raids had devastated literacy in England. Alfred sought to remedy this setback. Sir Frank Stenton famously wrote, "Alfred's unique importance in the history of English letters comes from his conviction that a life without knowledge or reflection was unworthy of respect." Alfred gathered at his court scholars who could do the work of translating Latin books into English. These scholars came from many parts of Europe, including England, France, and Germany, and translated authors such as Gregory the Great, St. Augustine, Bede, and Boethius. Alfred's literary revival was a first step toward the great learning of the High Middle Ages. He established a court school where his own children, the children of the upper nobility, and even many others of lesser birth could be educated. Alfred even took to studying Latin himself. Around the 890s, Alfred produced an Anglo-Saxon translation of St. Gregory the Great's Book of Pastoral Care, which would become the standard guidebook for bishops for centuries to come. Particularly important to Alfred was the idea that bishops had a duty to educate laymen. Through the trials of the Viking Age, Alfred the Great excelled both in war and in peace. Here was a king who defended his realm in battle and greatly improved the lives of his subjects, increasing security, fostering education, and equipping his people to protect and expand their inheritance once he had departed from them. With his victory at Edington, Alfred the Great eliminated the danger of a Viking conquest of Wessex. But Alfred's achievements didn't fully end the Danish menace, nor ensure his kingdom's stability. Even a monarch as capable as Alfred couldn't guarantee the triumph of his heirs. During the Middle Ages, each individual king's success was largely dependent on his own virtues. After Alfred's death, the neighboring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex bound themselves even closer together. Alfred himself had been married to a Mercian princess, and his daughter, Ethelfled, was married to the Lord of Mercia, Ethelred. Alfred's son and heir, Edward the Elder, took the throne of Wessex in 899. Edward enjoyed a close relationship with his brother-in-law, Ethelred, and together they acted against the Danish Vikings that still ruled much of northern and eastern England. Edward and Ethelred expanded King Alfred's fortress-building project into Mercia. When Ethelred's health began to fail, his wife, Ethelfled, known affectionately to the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers as the Lady of the Mercians, took a more active role, fortifying the city walls of Chester in 907, installing a garrison there to secure the surrounding territory, which lay near to a considerable Viking settlement. In 909, King Edward took the offensive. Joined by a force of Mercians, he executed a successful attack on the Danes of Northumbria. The next year, the Danes retaliated by raiding Mercia, but the combined levies of Wessex and Mercia caught up with the Danes as they were withdrawing to their own territory. The result, an astounding Anglo-Saxon victory. The chronicle mentions 12 Viking leaders who died in the fighting, a serious setback for the Danes. Ethelred of Mercia died the following year, in 911, leaving power in the hands of his wife. Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, drew her territory into an ever closer alliance with her brother, King Edward, allowing him to annex Oxford and London, which could be more easily defended by the army of Wessex. Ethelfled also brought her brother's son and heir, Athelstan, into her own court to be reared among the Mercians, effectively preparing him to rule over both territories. Lady Ethelfled also continued to build fortresses along the western approach to Mercia. Meanwhile, Edward battled his way up the east coast against Danish armies that were occasionally supported by visiting Viking fleets. Over the next decade, he built some 26 new fortresses, which would make the hostile penetration of inner England a very dangerous proposition for any bold Viking raiders. 917 proved to be a crucial year of combat. That April, Edward built a fort at Towcester, which was successfully defended against a Viking attack. Ethelfled's troops drove the Danes from Derby in the east in a battle that resulted in the death of 4 of her best warriors. A large English force from Kent, Surrey, and Essex captured the Viking fort of Colchester after a fierce battle. By year's end, Edward controlled the whole of East Anglia. The next year, in 918, Ethelfled's men conquered Leicester, and that June she received tribute from the Danes of York. She died on the 12th of that month, having ruled wisely and earned the love of her people. Her daughter, Alfwin, was briefly installed as her successor, though Edward was the true power. By December of 919, Edward removed Alfwin from her office and placed her in a convent in Wessex, with no opposition from the Mercian nobles. From now on, Wessex and Mercia would be a united realm. By 920, Edward the Elder ruled all of England south of the Mersey and Humber. He died in 924, having greatly built upon the success of his father. Edward's son Athelstan now took the throne, having been raised like a son by his aunt Ethelfled. Athelstan was as readily accepted as heir in Mercia as he was in Wessex. King Edward the Elder and Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, son and daughter to Alfred the Great, showed themselves worthy heirs of their father. In their time, the Viking threat was everywhere reduced, and the dream of a united English kingdom was closer to a reality than ever before. Athelstan, inheritor of the legacy of Alfred the Great, Lady Ethelfled, and Edward the Elder, began his reign on a strong foundation, but in his time he too would face great challenges. Initially, he tried to negotiate with the Viking rulers of York, marrying his sister to their chieftain, and securing their agreement to convert to Christianity. But when York's ruler reneged on his new religion and his new bride, Athelstan launched an invasion. In 927, Aethelstan drove Olaf and his Vikings from York. At last, the King of Wessex directly controlled the northern stronghold of York. It was around this time that Aethelstan began styling himself Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. It's clear that already Aethelstan had begun to envision an England united under a single Anglo-Saxon king. Yet his kingdom was hardly at peace. Olaf's Dublin-based Vikings joined with the Norwegians of Northumbria for a major raid against Mercia. Aethelstan and his brother Edmund responded in 937, leading their Anglo-Saxons north. They encountered Olaf's Viking coalition, bolstered by the forces of Constantine of Scotland at the Battle of Brunanburh. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts the episode dramatically. Edward's sons clove the shield wall, hewed the lindenwood shields with hammered swords, for it was natural to men of their lineage to defend their land, their treasure, and their homes in frequent battle against every foe. Their enemies perished, the people of the Scots and the pirates fell doomed. The field grew dark with the blood of men from the time when the sun, that glorious luminary, the bright candle of God, of the Lord eternal, moved over the earth in the hours of morning, until that noble creation sank at its setting. There lay many a man destroyed by the spears, many a northern warrior shot over his shield, and likewise many a Scot lay weary, sated with battle. The whole day long the West Saxons with mounted companies kept in pursuit of hostile peoples. Grievously they cut down the fugitives from behind with their whetted swords. The Mercians refused not hard conflict to any men who with Olaf had sought this land in the bosom of a ship over the tumult of the waters, coming doomed to the fight. 5 young kings lay on that field of battle, slain by the swords, and also 7 of Olaf's earls, and a countless host of seamen and Scots. Brunanburh was a moment to rival Alfred's victory at Edington. It preserved the hegemony of Wessex, and some scholars have even argued that it was crucial to the formation of a united English identity. But the victory did not eliminate Viking ambition in the region. 2 years later, Aethelstan died, and Olaf managed to regain power in York. Once more, Wessex was faced with a Viking-ruled northern England. Olaf's domination of both Dublin and York might have proved far more dangerous to Wessex, but Olaf died himself in 941. Aethelstan's brother Edmund gained the throne and soundly defeated the York-Dublin Vikings, forcing them to relinquish their territory south of the Humber. The fate of York would continue to be an issue for the heirs of King Alfred. The final Viking to struggle with Wessex over the north of England was Eric Bloodaxe, so named because he killed 2 of his brothers. Once King of Norway, Eric gained control of York on 2 occasions, but once he was expelled in 954, Wessex once again dominated the whole of England. The territories that had constituted the Danelaw, after some 100 years, were once again in English hands.